Hey, beautiful souls, welcome back to Soul Stories. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe to join our family. Stay with us, because a new love story is about to begin. The Arizona sun burned mercilessly against the cracked earth as Samuel Hendricks rode his exhausted mare through the canyon that locals called Devil's Throat. He had been traveling for 3 days, searching for the dozen cattle that had wandered from his struggling ranch during the storm that had torn through the territory last week. Samuel was 34 years old, a man carved from hardship and loneliness. His wife had died giving birth to their stillborn son 7 years ago, and since that terrible night he had closed his heart to everything except the land and the animals that depended on him. His ranch was small, barely surviving, but it was all he had left of the dreams he and his beloved Margaret had once shared. He never saw them coming. One moment he was guiding his horse through the narrow passage, and the next he was surrounded by Apache warriors on painted horses. Their faces were stern, their weapons drawn, and Samuel knew immediately that resistance would mean death. They took his rifle, his pistol, and his knife. They bound his hands with leather straps and led him deeper into the wilderness, away from everything familiar. Samuel did not struggle. He had learned long ago that fate had its own plans, and fighting against the current only exhausted a man faster. After hours of travel, they arrived at a village nestled in a hidden valley. The place was beautiful in a way that caught Samuel off guard. Water flowed from a spring, children played near the stream, and women worked around cooking fires and animal hides. It looked peaceful, almost sacred. The warriors brought him before an elderly woman who sat outside the largest dwelling. Her hair was silver, her face lined with the wisdom of countless seasons, and her eyes held a sharpness that seemed to pierce through Samuel's very soul. She spoke in her language, and a younger woman translated. This translator was striking, with dark eyes that held both suspicion and curiosity. Her name, he would later learn, was Ayana, which meant eternal blossom. The elder woman spoke for a long time, and when she finished, Ayana turned to Samuel with an expression he could not read. She explained that he had been captured on sacred land that white settlers had been encroaching upon for years. Many of their people had suffered at the hands of ranchers and soldiers. The elders had decided that he would not be killed, but he could not simply leave either. Samuel asked what they wanted from him. Ayana's eyes never left his as she delivered the verdict. He was ordered to please all the Apache women before they would let him leave. He must serve them, help them, prove through his actions that not all white men carried hatred in their hearts. He must work alongside them, learn their ways, and show respect for their lives and their labor. Only when every woman in the village, from the eldest grandmother to the youngest mother, declared herself satisfied with his character and his contribution, would he be permitted to return to his world. Samuel understood. This was not cruelty. This was a test, and so his trial began. The first weeks were brutal. Samuel was given to the women who prepared hides, and they showed him no mercy. His hands, already rough from ranch work, cracked and bled as he scraped and stretched animal skins under the harsh sun. The women watched him with hard eyes, waiting for him to complain, to show the arrogance they expected from his kind. But Samuel did not complain. He worked silently, accepting correction when he made mistakes, pushing through the pain without asking for rest. At night he slept on the ground outside the dwelling they had assigned him, staring up at stars that looked different somehow, as if even the sky knew he was far from home. An elderly woman named Nasha was the first to soften toward him. She had lost her husband and 3 sons to conflicts with settlers, and her hatred for white men ran deeper than the canyon walls. Yet she watched Samuel carry water for her when her old bones ached too much to make the trip herself. She watched him repair her dwelling after a windstorm without being asked. She watched him give his portion of food to her granddaughter when supplies ran short. One evening, Nasha sat beside him and told him, through broken words and gestures, about her sons She showed him a beaded necklace that had belonged to her youngest boy, killed at only 16 summers. Samuel listened with tears in his eyes, and when she finished, he told her about Margaret and the baby boy who never drew breath. They sat together in shared grief, two people from different worlds who had both known the cruelest form of loss. When Nasha rose to leave, she placed her weathered hand on his shoulder and spoke a single word that Ayana later translated as acceptable. One woman had given her approval. Ayana herself was the most difficult to reach. She was the chief's daughter, proud and fierce, and she made no secret of her distrust. She assigned Samuel the hardest tasks, criticized his efforts relentlessly, and seemed determined to break him. But something began to shift between them during the long hours they spent together. Ayana was required to translate and supervise his work, which meant they were rarely apart. Samuel learned fragments of her language, and she reluctantly admitted that his pronunciation was improving. He asked questions about her people's history, their beliefs, their connection to the land, and his interest was genuine. One afternoon, while they gathered herbs near the stream, Ayana suddenly stopped walking and turned to face him. She asked why he had not tried to escape. The village was not heavily guarded. A determined man could slip away in the darkness and take his chances in the wilderness. Samuel considered her question carefully before answering. He told her that running away would mean he had something to be ashamed of. He had done nothing wrong by crossing that land, but he understood that her people had every reason to distrust strangers. If proving himself through honest work was the price of his freedom, then he would pay it willingly. Besides, he added quietly, he was learning things here that he had never known before. Things about himself, about what truly mattered. Ayana said nothing, but her expression changed. The hardness around her eyes softened, just slightly, like the first crack in winter ice. Summer turned to autumn, and Samuel's place in the village evolved. The women no longer watched him with suspicion, but instead included him in their conversations, their laughter, their daily rhythms. He learned to grind corn, to weave baskets, to read the weather by the behavior of birds. He played with the children who had once hidden from him, teaching them simple games from his own childhood while they taught him theirs. He also found himself thinking about Ayana constantly. She was unlike any woman he had ever known. She rode horses with the skill of any warrior, spoke her mind without hesitation, and possessed a depth of intelligence that continued to surprise him. Yet beneath her strength, Samuel glimpsed vulnerability, the weight of responsibility she carried as her father's only surviving child, the loneliness of a woman caught between tradition and her own desires. One night, the village held a celebration for the harvest season. There was music, dancing, and a feast that brought everyone together under the vast canopy of stars. Samuel sat at the edge of the gathering, feeling like an outsider despite how far he had come. Ayana appeared beside him, holding 2 cups of warm herbal drink. She sat down and handed him one without speaking. For a long time they simply watched the dancers, the firelight casting moving shadows across the earth. Then Ayana spoke. She told him that her mother had died when she was young, and her father had raised her alone. He had taught her to be strong, to never show weakness, to protect her people at any cost. She had always believed that white men were incapable of understanding anything beyond their own greed. She paused, looking at him with an intensity that made his heart pound. But he had changed her mind, she admitted. He had shown her patience when she offered only hostility. He had worked without complaint when she pushed him beyond reasonable limits. He had treated every woman in this village with respect and kindness, expecting nothing in return. Samuel set down his cup and turned to face her fully. He told her that he had learned more about honor and community in these months than in his entire previous life. His world valued possession and conquest, but her world valued company, connection and contribution. He understood now why her people fought so hard to protect what they had. He also told her that somewhere along the way he had fallen in love with her. The words hung in the air between them. Ayana's breath caught, and for a moment Samuel feared he had destroyed everything. But then she reached out and took his hand, her fingers intertwined with his, warm and strong, and when she looked at him, there were tears glistening in her dark eyes. She said that she had tried to hate him, she had tried so hard, but every day her hatred grew weaker, and something else grew in its place, something that frightened her more than any enemy ever could. She loved him too. They sat together until the fires burned low, speaking in whispers about impossible futures and improbable dreams. They both knew that their love faced obstacles that seemed insurmountable. His world and hers had been at war for generations. Even if the women granted his release, where could they possibly go? But that night, none of that mattered. All that mattered was the warmth of her hand in his and the truth that had finally been spoken aloud. The following weeks were bittersweet. Samuel continued his work, but now Ayana was openly by his side, not as a supervisor but as a partner. The village women noticed the change between them and reacted with mixed emotions. Some smiled knowingly, seeing the same love that had touched their own lives. Others worried about what it would mean for their chief's daughter to give her heart to an outsider. The chief himself, a dignified man named Ahiga, summoned Samuel to his dwelling one cold morning. Through Ayana's translation, Ahiga spoke for a long time. He told Samuel about the history of broken promises, the treaties that white men had signed and then violated, the graves of his ancestors that settlers had desecrated without remorse. He had every reason to hate Samuel simply for the color of his skin. But, he continued, he had watched this rancher from the moment he arrived. He had seen him suffer without self-pity, work without resentment, and open his heart to a people who had shown him only hostility. Most importantly, he had seen the way Samuel looked at his daughter, with reverence and devotion rather than possession and conquest. Ahiga asked one question. Would Samuel be willing to give up everything he knew to stay in this world, to become part of a people who were not his own, to face the hardships and dangers that came with loving an Apache woman? Samuel did not hesitate. He said yes, but Ahiga shook his head. He could not accept that answer yet. First, Samuel must return to his own world, settle his affairs, and truly understand what he would be leaving behind. Only then could he make a choice with full knowledge of its weight. The final gathering of women took place 3 days later. One by one they spoke. Nasha declared that Samuel had shown her a heart capable of great tenderness. The Enji mothers praised his gentleness with their children. The weavers acknowledged his patience in learning their craft. The healers noted his respect for their knowledge. When the last woman had spoken, the elder who had first judged him rose slowly to her feet. She walked to where Samuel stood and placed her hands on either side of his face, studying him with those penetrating eyes. She spoke in her language, and Ayana translated with a trembling voice. The elder said that when Samuel first arrived, she had seen a broken man, empty and lost. Now she saw someone who had been healed by the very people he had been taught to fear. He had pleased them all, not through servitude but through genuine transformation. He was free to go. But the elder added one more thing. She had lived many seasons and had learned to recognize when two souls were meant to walk the same path. Samuel's soul and Ayana's soul had recognized each other. Whatever choice he made, he should know that he would always have a place among them. Samuel left the village the next morning, riding the same mare that had carried him into captivity months before. Ayana stood at the edge of the settlement, watching him go, and though neither of them spoke, their eyes communicated everything words could not contain. He returned to his ranch to find it ravaged by neglect and weather. His cattle were gone, scattered, or stolen. His house was barely standing. Everything he had worked for had crumbled in his absence. Yet, standing amid the ruins of his former life, Samuel felt nothing but certainty. He spent 3 weeks settling his debts, selling the land to a neighboring rancher who had always coveted it, and gathering the few possessions that held meaning for him. Margaret's wedding ring went into his pocket, not as a chain to the past, but as a blessing for the future. He knew somehow that she would have wanted him to find happiness again. When he rode back into the Apache Valley, the children saw him first. They ran toward him shouting and laughing, and within moments the entire village knew of his return. Ayanna emerged from her father's dwelling, her face a mixture of disbelief and overwhelming joy. She ran to him as he dismounted, throwing herself into his arms with an abandon that surprised everyone who knew her proud nature. She asked him if he was certain, if he truly understood what he was choosing. Samuel held her tightly and said that he had never been more certain of anything in his life. He had spent years building a future from loneliness and loss. Now he wanted to build a future from love and belonging. Ahiga approached them, his expression solemn but his eyes warm. He placed his hand on Samuel's shoulder and spoke a single sentence that needed no translation. "Welcome home." The wedding ceremony took place under a full moon, with the entire village gathered in celebration. Samuel wore traditional garments that the women had spent days preparing. Ayanna was a doe, R&D with beads and feathers that had been passed down through generations of her family. As they stood before the elder who had once held his fate in her hands, Samuel looked at the woman beside him and felt the last fragments of his old grief dissolve. He had been captured and ordered to please the Apache women, but what had truly happened was something far more profound. He had been set free, free from the prison of his sorrow, free from the narrow world that had defined him, free to love and be loved in ways he had never imagined possible. When the ceremony concluded and the celebrations began, Ayanna leaned close to him and whispered in his ear. She asked if he ever regretted being captured that day in the canyon. Samuel kissed her forehead and smiled. He told her it was the luckiest day of his life. And as the drums played and the stars wheeled overhead, the rancher who had come as a prisoner danced with his bride, finally understanding that home was never a place. Home was a person. Home was her.